It was late at night when investigators arrived at the location. There were no cameras outside, no crowd, no sense of urgency from the outside world. It looked like a normal follow-up visit, the kind that usually ends without anything unusual. The building itself was quiet. Most of the lights were off. The hallway was empty, and every sound echoed slightly as the officers moved toward the apartment. When they entered the room, nothing immediately stood out. The space looked ordinary, a bed neatly arranged, a desk in the corner, a laptop placed carefully on the table, a phone lying beside it. There were no visible signs of panic, no mess, no attempt to rush or escape. At first glance, everything appeared controlled. One of the investigators began examining the laptop. It powered on normally, the desktop was clean, files were organized in a way that did not raise suspicion. It looked like the system had been maintained carefully. The phone told a similar story. No obvious messages, no unusual apps, no immediate evidence that suggested anything serious. For a moment, it seemed like this would be another routine check that leads nowhere. But then, something small caught attention. On the laptop, there was a directory that did not match the rest of the system. It had no proper name, no clear label. It did not belong to any visible category. It was just there. At first, it looked empty. The folder opened with nothing inside, no files, no subfolders, nothing that could be seen through a normal view. Many people would have ignored it and moved on. But experienced investigators know that sometimes what looks empty is not truly empty. So they decided to take a closer look. They ran a basic forensic scan. Within seconds, the system began showing hidden layers of data, files that had been deleted, fragments that were still present but not visible through normal access, encrypted traces that required deeper analysis to understand. The atmosphere in the room slowly changed. What started as a quiet, routine inspection was becoming something else. The investigators stopped treating the devices as ordinary objects. Now every click mattered. Every discovery could lead to something bigger. They continued the scan. More data began to appear, timestamps that did not match visible activity, logs that suggested files had been accessed and removed multiple times, patterns that indicated deliberate effort to hide information. At this point, it was clear that this was no longer a simple situation. Someone had taken time to organize the system in a way that would look clean on the surface, but underneath that surface, there were signs of hidden activity, the kind of activity that does not appear by accident, the kind that requires intention. The investigators carefully documented everything. They avoided making quick conclusions. Instead, they focused on collecting and preserving the data. Because in cases like this, the smallest detail can become the most important piece of the story. As the analysis continued, one thing became certain. This discovery was only the beginning. What they had found so far was not the full picture. It was just the first layer. And whatever was hidden beneath it was going to take time to uncover. As the forensic process moved forward, the investigators stopped looking at the data as individual files. Instead, they started looking for patterns, because in cases like this, the real story is not in one file, it is in how everything connects. At first, nothing looked obvious. There were no clear labels, no direct explanations, no single piece of data that could immediately explain what was going on. But slowly, a structure began to appear. The recovered data showed signs of repeated activity. Certain timestamps appeared again and again, almost like something had been accessed on a schedule. Not daily, not random, but in intervals that felt deliberate. This was the first sign that whatever had happened here was not accidental. It had a pattern. The The investigators then focused on usage behavior. They analyzed when the device was active, when files were opened, and when data was modified or removed. What they found was unusual. There were moments when the system showed almost no activity at all, and then suddenly, short periods where multiple actions happened very quickly. Files accessed, data moved, traces altered, and then silence again. This kind of behavior raised questions. Because it did not match normal usage, it looked controlled, almost like someone knew exactly what they were doing and when to do it. Next, they examined the storage paths. Some of the recovered traces pointed toward locations that were not easy to access through normal navigation. Hidden directories, nested folders, paths that required multiple steps to even reach, these were not places an average user would go, which suggested something important. The system had been used with intention, not just to store information, but to manage it in a way that avoided attention. As the deeper layers were analyzed, fragments of data began to connect. Small pieces that seemed meaningless on their own started forming sequences. And those sequences started telling a story. Not a complete story, but enough to show that something had been carefully organized, then partially removed. The investigators also noticed signs of repeated deletion, not a single cleanup, but multiple attempts over time. This indicated something else. Whatever was being handled on this device was being revisited, changed, managed, not just used once and forgotten. At this point, the focus shifted from what is here to why was this handled this way, because the method itself was becoming more important than the content. Why hide files this deeply? Why access them in controlled intervals? Why remove traces again and again instead of once? These questions did not have immediate answers, but they changed the direction of the investigation. Now it was no longer just about recovering data. It was about understanding behavior, and behavior, in many cases, reveals more than the data itself. As the session continued, one thing became clear. This was not random digital clutter. It was structured, it was managed, and it was intentionally kept out of sight. The investigators paused for a moment, not because they were finished, but because they understood something important. They were no longer just uncovering hidden files. They were stepping into a system that had been carefully controlled from the inside. And whatever they were beginning to see was still only part of a much larger picture. By this point, the investigation had shifted into a different phase. It was no longer about discovering hidden traces. Now, it was about understanding the full scope of what those traces meant. The devices were no longer treated as simple evidence. They were now considered part of a larger system. So the investigators expanded their approach. They began working with digital forensic specialists, people trained to reconstruct activity from even the smallest fragments of data. The first step was to rebuild a timeline, not a basic one, but a detailed sequence of events. They used timestamps, system logs, and recovered fragments to map out when the device was active and what was happening during those moments. At first, the timeline looked incomplete. There were gaps, periods of silence where no activity was recorded. But as more data was processed, those gaps started to fill in, not completely, but enough to reveal a pattern. Certain time windows appeared again and again, short, controlled sessions of activity. During these sessions, multiple actions would take place in a very short amount of time. Access, movement, modification, then everything would stop. The system would go quiet again. This repeated behavior raised new questions. Because it suggested planning, not casual use, not random behavior, something more structured. The investigators then expanded beyond the device itself. They began examining possible external connections. Was the device interacting with other systems? Was data being transferred somewhere else? This part of the investigation was slower, more technical, but also more revealing. Network traces, even when limited, can leave behind subtle signs. And in this case, there were indicators that the device had connected to external storage or remote locations at certain points in time. Not constantly, not openly, but in brief, controlled moments. This added another layer to the case. Now, it was not just about what existed on the device, but what may have existed elsewhere. The team also looked at user behavior in a different way. Instead of focusing only on files, they studied interaction patterns, how the system was used, how quickly actions were performed, which sequences repeated over time, and what they found was consistent. The behavior showed familiarity. Confidence, the kind of usage that comes from someone who knows exactly how the system works. There were no signs of hesitation, no random exploration. Every action appeared intentional. At this stage, the investigators became more cautious. Because the deeper they went, the more complex the case became. Each answer led to new questions. Each discovery opened another path. They documented everything carefully, every recovered fragment, every reconstructed sequence, every unusual pattern. Because in cases like this, meaning does not come from a single discovery. It comes from how all the pieces connect over time. And slowly, that connection was starting to take shape, not fully, not clearly, but enough to understand one thing. This was not a simple situation. It was layered, it was controlled, and it extended beyond what could be seen at first glance. As the analysis continued, the investigators realized something important. They were not just uncovering hidden activity. They were following a trail that had been partially erased but not completely, and as long as even a small part of that trail remained, it could still lead somewhere. The only question was how far it would go, and what would be waiting at the end of it. As the investigation moved toward its later stages, the atmosphere began to change once again. Not because everything was clear, but because enough had been uncovered to raise serious questions. The investigators had gathered fragments, patterns, timelines, and behavior analysis. Individually, each piece was incomplete. But together, they formed something more significant, something that could no longer be ignored. At this point, the focus shifted from discovery to interpretation. What did all of this mean? What story was hidden behind the patterns? And more importantly, what could actually be proven? Because in any investigation, there is a difference between suspicion and evidence. The team reviewed everything again. Carefully, slowly, they avoided assumptions. They focused only on what could be supported by data. Even then, the situation remained complex. Some parts of the timeline were still unclear. Some actions could be seen, but not fully explained. And some connections raised more questions than answers. This uncertainty became part of the case itself. Because sometimes what cannot be fully explained is just as important as what can. As reports were prepared, the findings were documented in detail. Every recovered trace, every repeated pattern, every unusual behavior, all of it was organized into a structured format, not to tell a dramatic story, but to present a clear and accurate record of what had been found. At the same time, discussions began about possible next steps, legal review, further analysis, and decisions about how the case would move forward. But even as those discussions took place, one thing remained clear. This case was not simple. It did not offer easy conclusions. It did not provide a single, clear answer. Instead, it presented a series of connected events that required careful interpretation. Outside of the investigation, there were no immediate reactions. No public statements, no clear narrative. From the outside, everything remained quiet, but inside the case files, a different picture was forming. One built on details that were not visible to the public, one that required patience to understand, and even then, some parts remained unresolved. As time passed, the investigation reached a point where all available data had been analyzed. Every accessible layer had been explored. Every possible connection had been considered. What remained was not a complete story, but a framework. A structure built from evidence, gaps, and unanswered questions. And in many ways, that is what made the case stand out. Not just what was found, but what could not be fully explained. Because sometimes, the most important part of an investigation is not the final answer. It is the questions that remain. Questions like, why was the data handled in this way? What was the intention behind the patterns? And is there more that was never discovered? These questions do not always have clear answers, but they stay. They continue to exist, even after the investigation slows down, and they leave behind a sense that the full truth may be more complex than what is visible. In the end, the case did not close with certainty. It did not provide a simple conclusion. Instead, it left a quiet but powerful impact. A reminder that in some investigations, the surface only tells part of the story, and what lies beneath is not always fully revealed.